You did everything right. You faced your shadow. You integrated your wounds. You awakened to deeper truths about reality, about yourself, about the illusions you'd been living under. And then, silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence you expected, but something more unsettling. The fire that once drove you forward, your ambitions, your goals, your very sense of purpose, simply went out. You should feel liberated. Instead, you feel empty. You should feel motivated by your new awareness. Instead, you can barely find the energy to care about anything that once mattered. Carl Jung knew this would happen. In fact, he considered it not just inevitable, but necessary. What you're experiencing isn't a failure of your spiritual journey. It's the most crucial phase of what Jung called individuation. But here's what no one tells you. This emptiness, this apparent loss of drive, isn't what it appears to be. It's not depression. It's not spiritual bypassing. It's not even stagnation. It's your psyche undergoing what Jung called Enantiodromia, the mysterious process where any psychological extreme transforms into its opposite. And modern neuroscience has finally caught up to Jung's century-old insight, revealing exactly why your motivation had to die for something far more authentic to be born. Carl Jung discovered something that changed psychology forever, a principle he called Enantiodromia. It's an ancient Greek concept, meaning a running counter to the idea that when any psychological force reaches its extreme, it inevitably transforms into its opposite. Think of it as the psyche's natural law of balance. For most of your life, your motivation came from what Jung called the ego complex, that part of your psyche driven by recognition, achievement, security, and social approval. Even when you thought you were pursuing spiritual growth, the ego was often still in the driver's seat, wanting to be the enlightened one, the healed one, the awakened one. This ego-driven motivation operates through what modern neuroscience calls the sympathetic nervous system, that fight-or-flight state that floods your body with stress hormones and keeps you perpetually striving, pushing, achieving. But Jung understood something that took neuroscience decades to discover. This anxious, driven state is unsustainable for true individuation. When you do real inner work, when you face your shadow, integrate your wounds, and begin to see through the ego's illusions, enantiodromia kicks in. The extreme of ego-driven motivation flips into its opposite, a profound inner stillness. Your nervous system shifts from what Dr. Stephen Porges calls sympathetic activation, that anxious, achievement-oriented state, into ventral vagal activation, a state of deep safety and connection. But here's the paradox Jung observed. This healthier nervous system state initially feels like death. Because it is death. The death of the false motivational system. The death of the ego's desperate hunger for external validation. The death of what Jung called the provisional life. The life you live while waiting for your real life to begin. Jung wrote, "There is no birth of consciousness without pain. And what you're experiencing right now, this apparent emptiness, this loss of drive, is the labor pains of your authentic self being born." Jung spent 20 years studying medieval alchemy, not for its chemistry, but for its psychology. He discovered that those ancient alchemists weren't really trying to turn lead into gold. They were mapping the process of psychological transformation. And they had a specific term for what you're experiencing right now. Nigredo, the blackening. Nigredo is the necessary first stage of the alchemical process, where all the old forms must dissolve before anything new can emerge. The alchemists knew that you cannot skip this phase. You cannot rush through it. You cannot positive think your way around it. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his patients. After a significant psychological breakthrough, they would enter what he called the creative illness, a period of apparent regression that was actually profound reorganization. Modern research validates Jung's observations completely. Dr. Lisa Miller's studies at Columbia University show that spiritual awakening activates 4 specific brain regions simultaneously, the very areas that regulate motivation, meaning-making, and social connection. But here's the crucial insight. These brain changes don't happen overnight. There's a gap, sometimes months, sometimes years, between the dismantling of your old neurological patterns and the full emergence of your new ones. This gap is your Nigredo phase. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But becoming who you truly are requires a kind of psychological death and rebirth that our culture has no patience for. We live in a world that pathologizes stillness, that medicates mystery, that tries to fix what might not be broken at all. But Jung knew better. He understood that some forms of emptiness are not hollow, they are pregnant. Pregnant with a new form of motivation that doesn't come from fear, from lack, from the ego's endless hunger for more. Pregnant with what he called the transcendent function, the psychological process that bridges the conscious and unconscious, creating an entirely new attitude toward life. But here's where most people, and even many therapists, get it catastrophically wrong. They misinterpret this sacred pause as pathology. They try to fix what doesn't need fixing. They attempt to restart what needed to stop. Jung identified 3 dangerous misunderstandings that can derail your entire individuation process. Misunderstanding 1. This must be depression. Jung was adamant about this distinction. The collapse of the persona is often mistaken for depression. Clinical depression involves hopelessness, worthlessness, an inability to feel pleasure or connection. But what you're experiencing is fundamentally different. You're not hopeless, you're between hope systems. You're not worthless, you're questioning worth itself. You can still feel joy, love, connection. You just can't feel motivated by the old carrots and sticks. Modern research validates Jung's distinction completely. Studies show that individuals undergoing spiritual transformation exhibit brain patterns distinct from clinical depression. The default mode network, associated with self-referential thinking, becomes less active, but areas associated with present moment awareness and compassion actually increase. Jung called this the differentiating phase, where your psyche learns to distinguish between authentic desires and inherited compulsions. Misunderstanding 2. I need to get my old motivation back. This is like a butterfly trying to crawl back into its cocoon. Jung observed that his patients often panicked during the Nigredo phase and desperately tried to restart their old goal-setting systems, their old achievement patterns, their old identity structures. But attempting to reanimate dead motivational systems is not just futile, it's harmful. It's what Jung called regressive restoration of the persona. Your nervous system has evolved beyond the sympathetic activation that once fueled your ambitions. Trying to force that anxious, driven state back online is like trying to run your adult life on the psychological operating system of a threatened child. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Part of accepting yourself completely is accepting that who you were, including how you were motivated, was just a stage, not your true identity. Misunderstanding 3. I should transcend all desires. This is the spiritual bypassing trap that Jung warned against throughout his career. Some people, when they experience the death of ego-driven motivation, conclude that all motivation is ego, all desires are illusion, all goals are attachment. They float above life, rather than engaging with it more authentically. But Jung understood that the goal of individuation is not to escape the human experience, it's to participate in it more fully, more consciously, more genuinely. He distinguished between what he called the first half of life, where we build an ego and achieve in the world, and the second half of life, where we find meaning beyond achievement. But the second half doesn't negate the first half, it transforms it. The Nigredo phase isn't meant to last forever. It's meant to empty you out, so something more authentic can emerge. Jung called this emerging force the transcendent function. Not transcendent in the sense of leaving Earth, but transcendent in the sense of bridging the gap between who you were and who you're becoming. Jung didn't just identify this phase, he developed specific methods for navigating it. These weren't abstract theories. These were practical tools he used with his patients and tested in his own psychological laboratory during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious from 1913 to 1919. Active imagination. Dialoguing with the void. Instead of trying to think your way out of the emptiness, Jung discovered you could engage with it directly. Active imagination involves allowing images, symbols, or inner figures to emerge from your unconscious, and then consciously dialoguing with them. Jung wrote, "The unconscious is not a demonic monster, but a thing of nature that is perfectly neutral as far as moral sense, aesthetic taste, and intellectual judgment go." When you feel that familiar emptiness, instead of fighting it or analyzing it, you can ask it, "What are you here to teach me? What old part of me are you helping to die? What new part wants to emerge?" This isn't imagination in the sense of fantasy. It's what Jung called the reality of the psyche, engaging with the actual forces of transformation occurring within you. Amplification. Learning the language of your psyche. Jung discovered that the images and symbols emerging during transformation phases carry specific meanings that can guide you through the process. He developed a technique called amplification, connecting your personal symbols to their broader mythological, cultural, and archetypal meanings. If you find yourself drawn to images of deserts, Jung would have you explore what deserts represent across cultures. Purification, testing, the place where prophets receive visions. If you're experiencing dreams of death or dissolution, rather than being frightened, you learn to recognize these as classic transformation symbols, appearing in mythology worldwide. Your psyche is speaking to you in the oldest language humans know, the language of symbol and metaphor. Learning to understand this language turns confusion into guidance. The transcendent function. Building bridges. Jung's most practical tool was what he called the transcendent function, the psychological process that creates new attitudes by holding the tension between opposites. Instead of choosing between your old motivations and your new emptiness, you learn to hold both. Instead of seeing this as either spiritual awakening or practical life, you discover the third option that transcends but includes both. Jung wrote, "The transcendent function is the bridge between conscious and unconscious processes, partaking of both." Practically, this means allowing yourself to be empty and gradually noticing what genuinely calls to you from this emptiness. Not forcing new goals, but staying open to what emerges when you're not trying to manufacture motivation. Jung called it the birth of the self with a capital S. Not the ego self that hungers for recognition, but what he described as the archetype of wholeness, the deeper organizing principle of your psyche that connects you to something larger than your individual survival. And when this self begins to emerge, motivation returns. But it's motivation of an entirely different quality, from ambition to calling. Jung made a crucial distinction that changes everything. The difference between ambition and calling. Ambition comes from the ego's sense of lack. It drives you toward achievements that will finally prove your worth, finally give you security, finally make you lovable. But calling, what Jung termed the voice of the self, arises from a sense of fullness, seeking expression. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." When the self begins to speak, you're no longer trying to become someone worthy of love, you're expressing the love that you are. This shift shows up in your nervous system too. Instead of the anxious energy of sympathetic activation, you begin operating from what polyvagal theory calls ventral vagal activation, a state of calm alertness, social connection, and sustainable engagement. You move not because you're running from something, but because you're drawn toward something that resonates with your deepest nature, the energy of authenticity. Jung observed something remarkable in his patients who successfully navigated the Nigredo phase. They became more energetic than before, but the quality of their energy was completely different. Instead of the frantic energy of ego-driven achievement, they exhibited what he called the steady flame of purpose. One of Jung's patients, a successful businessman who had fallen into deep emptiness after a spiritual awakening, described it this way: "I used to work 60 hours a week powered by anxiety about failure. Now I work 40 hours a week, powered by excitement about contribution. I get more done, but it doesn't deplete me. It actually energizes me." This is what Jung meant by the union of opposites. You become both more restful and more productive, more peaceful and more passionate, more detached from outcomes and more engaged with the process. Modern neuroscience explains why. When you operate from authentic motivation rather than fear-based drive, your prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive center, functions more efficiently, requiring less energy to maintain focus and make decisions. The symbolic life. Jung introduced a concept that few people understand but changes everything once you grasp it. The symbolic life. Instead of living only on the literal level, chasing concrete goals for logical reasons, you begin living in conversation with meaning itself. You start noticing synchronicities, following curiosities that don't make rational sense, allowing yourself to be guided by what Jung called the wisdom of the unconscious. This isn't magical thinking. It's what Jung called paying attention to the intelligence of the whole psyche, not just the narrow rational mind. Jung himself discovered this during his own dark night of the soul. He began creating mandalas, not because anyone told him to, but because something in him was drawn to circular, sacred patterns. These weren't just art projects. They were maps of his psyche, reorganizing itself around a new center. The motivation that emerges from this place doesn't feel like motivation as you've known it. It feels more like resonance, like alignment, like saying yes to what's already moving through you, rather than pushing yourself toward what you think you should want. Jung called this living from the self rather than the ego. And once you taste this quality of motivation, the old driven, anxious energy feels not just exhausting, but somehow artificial. But here's what Jung insisted we must never forget. The goal of individuation is not to transcend the human experience, but to embody it more fully. The self doesn't negate the ego. It integrates the ego into a larger wholeness. You still need to pay bills, maintain relationships, contribute to the world. But now these activities serve something deeper than just survival or status. The practical mystic. Jung himself was the perfect example of this integration. He was a successful psychiatrist, a researcher, a writer, a family man. He engaged fully with the practical world, but all of these activities were in service of what he called the opus, the great work of becoming conscious. This is very different from spiritual bypassing, where people use transcendent insights to avoid practical responsibilities. Jung's approach was what we might call practical mysticism, bringing the insights of the depths into engaged living. When motivation returns after your Nigredo phase, it often looks surprisingly ordinary. You might find yourself called to teach, to create, to heal, to build something meaningful. But the quality of engagement is transformed. You're no longer performing to prove your worth. You're expressing what Jung called your unique configuration of consciousness, the particular way your individual psyche can serve the larger unfolding of life. The new relationship with achievement. Achievement doesn't disappear from your life. Your relationship to achievement transforms completely. Before individuation, you achieve to fill a hole. After individuation, you achieve to share your fullness. Before, external validation was life or death. After, it's pleasant when it comes, but not necessary for your sense of worth. Before, failure felt like evidence of your inadequacy. After, failure becomes information about what adjustments are needed. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." When your authentic self meets the world, both you and the world are enriched by the encounter. Living the questions. One final insight from Jung that can change everything. You don't need to have your new life figured out before you begin living it. Jung understood that individuation is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke, whose work Jung deeply admired, wrote, "Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer." Your Nigredo phase, this apparent emptiness, this loss of old motivations, is you living the question, who am I when I'm not trying to be anyone? And slowly, gently, without forcing or figuring out, you begin living into the answer, not through thinking, but through being, not through planning, but through responding to what calls to you in each moment. This is what Jung meant by the transcendent function, the mysterious process by which new life emerges from apparent death, new motivation emerges from apparent emptiness, new purpose emerges from the ashes of old ambitions. So here you are. Perhaps you began watching this video feeling broken, wondering what was wrong with you, why you couldn't find the drive that once carried you forward. But Jung would say you're not broken, you're breaking open. You're not losing yourself, you're finding yourself beneath the layers of who you thought you had to be. The sacred recognition. Let me ask you something that Jung asked his patients. What if this emptiness isn't a problem to be solved, but a sacred space to be honored? What if this loss of motivation isn't evidence of your failure, but proof of your evolution? What if this apparent void is actually pregnant with possibilities you've never dared to imagine? Jung spent his entire career studying one profound truth. The psyche knows how to heal itself if we learn to trust its wisdom rather than override its processes. Your loss of motivation for the old life isn't pathology, it's wisdom. Your nervous system, your psyche, your very soul is refusing to participate in patterns that no longer serve your authentic becoming. The questions that change everything. Jung believed that the right questions were more powerful than premature answers. So instead of asking, "How do I get my motivation back?" consider asking, "What is my psyche trying to protect me from returning to? What old version of myself is my soul helping me outgrow? What wants to emerge from this emptiness if I stop trying to fill it with the familiar? How might my apparent lack of motivation actually be my psyche's profound intelligence at work?" Jung wrote, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." This phase you're in, this Nigredo, this sacred emptiness, is your psyche's invitation to look inside with new eyes. A personal reflection. I want you to consider the possibility that you're not behind in life. You're exactly where you need to be for your unique individuation process to unfold. Jung observed that some souls require a complete dismantling of their motivational systems before their authentic calling can emerge. Not everyone needs to go through this degree of dissolution, but if you're here, if you're experiencing this, it likely means your psyche has a particularly profound transformation in store. The poet John Keats called it negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainty and doubt without irritably reaching after fact and reason. Jung would call it faith in the individuation process, trusting that your psyche knows what it's doing, even when your conscious mind feels lost. This isn't passive resignation, it's active trust. It's learning to differentiate between productive action and anxious doing. It's discovering that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply refuse to go back to a way of living that was slowly killing your soul. The community of the initiated. You are not alone in this experience. Jung understood that individuation, while deeply personal, is not meant to be a solitary journey. Throughout history, in every culture, there have been those who've undergone this particular form of psychological death and rebirth. The mystics, the artists, the healers, the visionaries, all of them passed through phases where their old motivations died before new ones were born. You are part of an ancient lineage of souls who've chosen depth over surface, authenticity over performance, becoming over having. In the comments below, I invite you to share your experience, not seeking advice or solutions, but simply witnessing and being witnessed in this sacred phase of your becoming. What has this loss of motivation taught you about who you thought you had to be? What whispers of authentic calling have you noticed emerging from the silence? What old dreams have you been grieving, and what new possibilities have begun to stir? The continuing journey. Jung's insights into the psyche go far deeper than what we can explore in a single conversation. The individuation process, this journey from ego-driven living to self-directed being, unfolds in stages that most people never learn to recognize or navigate. If this exploration has opened something in you, if Jung's map of psychological transformation resonates with your experience, then you're ready for the deeper teachings. In our next exploration, we'll dive into Jung's most revolutionary insight, how to recognize when your authentic self is beginning to speak, and how to distinguish its voice from the ego's desperate attempts to reassert control. We'll explore what Jung called the transcendent function in practical detail, specific techniques for bridging the gap between who you were and who you're becoming. Because while the Nigredo phase is necessary, it's not permanent. Something new is gestating in the darkness of your apparent emptiness. And Jung developed precise methods for midwifing that new life into being, the sacred patience. Until then, practice what Jung called sacred patience with your process. Trust that your psyche's timeline is wiser than your ego's urgency. Remember that the most profound transformations in nature happen slowly, in darkness, out of sight. The seed doesn't apologize for its time underground. The caterpillar doesn't rush its dissolution in the cocoon. The night doesn't hurry toward dawn. And you don't need to apologize for taking the time your soul requires to reorganize itself around a deeper truth. Jung's final insight was perhaps his most important. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not who your family wanted you to be. Not who society rewards you for being. Not even who your spiritual teachers told you to become. But who you truly are, beneath all the layers, beyond all the performance, at the very core of your authentic being. That person, your true self, is worth whatever darkness you must pass through to meet them. The motivation you've lost was never yours to begin with. It belonged to who you thought you had to be. The motivation that's coming will arise from who you actually are. And Jung would tell you, that's worth waiting for. But here's what Jung discovered that changes everything about your healing journey. This motivation loss might not be your biggest obstacle to wholeness. There's another invisible force that's been programming your relationships, your self-worth, and your deepest fears since before you could speak. What Jung called the mother complex. Watch this next to understand why you'll never fully heal until you see how the mother who lives inside your psyche controls your adult life.